whipped and salted, then left in the sun for crows. A cowboy washed her clean and gave her a cold stream. The bottle was empty, and I'd known it was empty since somewhere around 2 in the morning, but I kept tipping it back anyway because the motion of it felt like something. Arm up, throat open, the small, familiar weight of glass in my palm. There wasn't even the smell of whiskey left in it, just the ghost of it, just me and the ghost. That was the winter of my 53rd year, and I don't tell it to make myself sound pitiful. I tell it so you understand what she walked into. Her name was Cecilia Prout. She came on the wagon from Laramie the first Tuesday in November, the same day the creek froze to the bottom, and I had to break ice with a fence post to water the horses. I didn't know she was coming. I hadn't arranged for her. She'd written twice to my brother Cal, and Cal had written back, and then Cal had the decency to die in August before he could tell me a word of it. So she just arrived, stood at my gate in a coat that wasn't warm enough for Wyoming in November, and looked at the ranch, the sagged fence line, the barn with the roof gone soft on the north side, the house dark at 2 in the afternoon, and she didn't say a word about any of it. She said, "I'm Cecilia Prout. Cal Voss wrote me there was work here." I was standing in the barn door with ice melt still dripping from my fence post, and I'm sure I looked like something the land had chewed up and spat out, which was not far from wrong. I hadn't shaved in 3 weeks. I'd been sleeping in my coat. I said, "Cal's dead." She said, "I know that now. I'm sorry for your loss." A pause, not an awkward pause, a thinking pause. "Is there work anyway?" That was the whole of our introduction. I told her she could sleep in the tack room off the barn, which I'd cleared in better days for a hand that never showed, and that I'd pay her $2 a week to cook and mend and help with whatever the ranch needed. She said that was agreeable. She went back to the wagon and pulled down a trunk and a canvas sack and a crate with 3 chickens inside it, and she carried all of it herself before I thought to move. I watched her from the barn door, and I thought, this is some kind of test I am going to fail. I want to back up, not far. Just enough so you know what the ranch was, and what I was before she got there. Place was called the Voss Place, always had been. 312 acres of grass and sage, and a river bend that turned half to mud in summer and froze solid by late October. My father built the house in 1851, 2 rooms and then 4 and then 6 as boys kept coming. There were 4 of us Voss boys, and I was the second. I worked that land from the time I could walk behind a plow. I knew every gully and every stone of it the way you know the back of your own hand in the dark. My wife Alina died in the spring of 1882, fever. 8 days from the first cough to the last breath, and I was there for all 8 of them, and I couldn't do a single thing but watch and bring water and hold her hand while she went. She was 31 years old. After Alina, I kept going because that's the only thing I knew how to do. I fed the horses. I mended fence. I put up hay in August. I broke ice in November. I planted in May. I did every last thing a rancher is supposed to do, and I did it alone, and I did it correctly, and I did none of it for any reason I could tell you that wasn't just animal stubbornness. The drinking started slow. A glass in the evening, which any man might have, then 2, then the bottle at dinner, then another bottle by midnight. By the time Cecilia Prout walked through my gate, I was putting away the better part of a 5th a night, and waking up on the floor more often than not, and conducting most of my days inside a woolly half-drunk that made everything feel like it was happening behind glass, which was precisely the point. I am not telling you this because I'm proud of it. Cal wrote her. My brother Cal, who I hadn't spoken a full sentence to in 6 years because he'd borrowed money and never paid it back, and I'd held that like a splinter under my skin all that time, which I now see was a waste of the years I could have had with him. Cal looked at me from 3 states away, and saw a man drowning and wrote to a widow in Laramie, and said there was a ranch that needed a woman's hand and a man who needed more than he knew. He was right, and I hated him for it even after he was dead. She settled into the tack room. She had it neat inside of a day, a cot, a trunk, a little square of braided rug she'd brought, a shelf she built from scrap board for her books. 3 books. I noticed them because I hadn't seen a book in that house since Alina. She saw me looking and she didn't say anything about the books. She handed me a tin cup of coffee she'd already made and went back to work. The coffee was strong. I'd been making it weak because I kept losing track of how much ground I'd put in the pot. Hers hit the back of my throat and woke something up that had been asleep for a while. The first 2 weeks were just labor. She cooked in the mornings and evenings, and in between she worked. She wasn't a slight woman, medium height, broad in the shoulder, hands that had done real work for a long time. She could carry 2 full water buckets at a full walk without spilling a drop. She patched the kitchen roof in a cold drizzle and didn't complain about it. She looked at the sagged fence along the north pasture and said, "That'll need to come down and go back up." And I said I knew it did, and she said, "I can help with that when the ground softens," and I said nothing. She didn't try to talk to me. That was the thing I noticed first. She didn't fill silence the way some people do, as if silence is a wound that needs covering. She'd eat her supper and read her book, and the quiet between us was just quiet. I'd grown used to the particular silence of being alone, which is a loud silence, full of your own noise. Her silence was different. It had another person in it. I kept drinking. She saw it and she didn't say a word about it. Not that first week, not the second. She just cooked. She just worked. The mornings I was useless, and there were several the chores still got done. I should have felt shame about that. I think some part of me did, and I drank to cover that too. The night it broke open was a Saturday in December. There'd been a hard freeze coming in for 3 days, the kind you can feel in the air before it arrives, and I'd been worried about the young stock in the far pasture, 3 heifers not yet a year old. I told myself I'd go check on them in the morning. I told myself that and then sat down with a bottle, and the next thing I knew it was dark, and then it was darker, and I was very drunk, and I could hear the wind hitting the house like a live thing trying to get in. I woke on the floor at 3 in the morning with my coat still on and my face against the cold boards, and I knew immediately. The way a man who's worked cattle his whole life knows, something in the gut before the brain catches up. The temperature had dropped past what those young heifers could handle without shelter. I got up. My head swam so hard I had to hold the table. I put my boots on the wrong feet and didn't notice for a full minute. I got my hat and went for the door, and it opened before I reached it. She was already dressed. She had a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope over her shoulder, and she was wearing every layer she owned. She looked at me in the light of the lantern, coat misbuttoned, boots wrong, eyes not tracking straight, and she said nothing about any of it. She just said, "Far pasture. I heard you worrying about them last night." I hadn't said a word about the heifers to her. She'd heard it from the way I kept looking north at supper. We went together. The cold was the kind that makes your lungs ache on the first breath, and the lantern made a small yellow sphere of warmth against the black. I was sobering up fast in that cold the way you do when the body decides it has no choice. She led, and I followed, and I'm not ashamed of that. She had the lantern, and she was steadier on her feet than I was. 2 of the heifers were in the low draw on the eastern edge of the pasture, huddled together with their backs to the wind. The third was down. She was down on her side in a drift, about 60 yards from the draw. She wasn't dead. You can see that in an animal, the small movements, the breath, but she wasn't going to make it through the night in that drift. I went to my knees beside her without a word. She was a good heifer, red roan, the best of that summer's calves, and I'd thought more than once she might be a good breeding cow someday. I put my hand on her neck and she moved her head just slightly, which meant there was still something there to save. "She needs to move," I said. My voice came out strange, thick. Cecilia was already crouched at the heifer's back end. She'd looped the rope under the haunches before I'd gotten 3 words out. She looked at me across the heifer's body in the light of the lantern she'd set in the snow. She said, "On 3. We dragged that heifer 60 yards through knee-deep snow in the black cold of a Wyoming December, and I don't know how we did it except that I didn't think about anything else. She pulled and I pushed, and the heifer struggled and didn't help much, but struggled enough that she wasn't dead weight the whole way. By the time we got her into the draw with the other 2, I could feel my arms shaking from the inside out. Cecilia was breathing hard. She put her back against the bank of the draw and slid down until she was sitting in the snow, and she looked at the heifer, who was already trying to get her legs under her. Then she looked at me. I was still on my knees. I don't know when I'd gone to my knees. The shaking in my arms had moved up into my chest, and the cold had nothing to do with it. I had a thought I hadn't had in a long time. I thought I was needed here tonight. If I hadn't come, if she hadn't made me come, that heifer would be dead in the morning. A small thing, 1 heifer, but I sat with it in the cold for a minute. Cecilia didn't say anything. She just watched me like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. Not impatient, just present. I said I had the boots on the wrong feet. She said I noticed. I shouldn't have let it get that bad. She was quiet, a long quiet, then no. Just the one word, not a lecture. Not anything more than the truth of it, plain, the way you'd say the sky is overcast. She said it, and then she didn't say anything else, and somehow that was harder to sit with than a month of lectures would have been. We got the other 2 heifers into the draw, and I left Cecilia there with the lantern while I went back and got a load of hay to keep them through the night. 2 trips. By the second trip, my arms had stopped shaking. The cold was still vicious, but I was working inside it now instead of just taking it. When I got back, she was sitting against the bank with the heifer's head in her lap. The heifer had made it to her chest, front legs folded, which was a good sign. Cecilia had one hand resting on the animal's neck, and she was looking up at the stars, which had come out sharp and hard after the wind died. She didn't hear me come up. I stood there for a moment looking at her in the lantern light, her breath clouding, her hand steady on that heifer's neck, and something moved in me that I didn't have a name for. I sat down in the snow beside her, and we stayed there until the sky went gray. She didn't save me that night. I want to be clear about that. A man doesn't get saved in a night, not from what I'd let pile up on me, but something shifted, some small and important thing. January was brutal, the kind of cold that kills if you stop moving for too long. We worked together every day of it, and I learned her rhythms the way you learn a place, where she was cautious, where she was quick. What made her laugh, it was a short, surprised laugh, like she didn't expect things to be funny, and when something was, she was almost offended by it. She could read weather better than I could, which took me until the second week to admit and the third to say out loud. She'd look at the color of the afternoon sky and tell me what the night would bring, and she was right more often than not. I cut back on the drinking, not all at once. Not because she told me to, she never told me to. But the nights I'd been filling with whiskey started filling with other things, with tiredness that came from actual work, with conversation sometimes if the fire was going and neither of us was too worn out. She read her books, and occasionally I'd ask what she was reading, and she'd tell me, and sometimes she'd read a passage out loud, and I'd listen without saying much. One night in late January, she read me something from a book about a man who'd lost everything and built it back up. Not the same as before, but differently, and she didn't read it to make a point. I think she just liked the passage, but I sat with it for a long time afterward. She'd been married. I knew that she was a widow. I didn't ask for a long time, and she didn't offer. One evening in February, snow coming down outside, she told me without my asking. His name was Robert. He died 4 years before, a kick from a horse that shouldn't have been fatal but was. 2 weeks in bed and then gone. She said it plainly. She said she'd spent 2 years after him not knowing what to do with herself, and then she decided that not doing something was its own kind of dying, and she'd started writing letters. She'd written letters to 3 different ranchers. Mine, Cal's, was the only one she'd heard back from. I thought about that. 3 letters and only 1 answer, and that answer led her here, to a half-ruined ranch and a man sleeping off his grief in a whiskey bottle. I thought about what she could have found instead. A decent man on a prosperous spread, easier ground in every direction. I said, "You could have found better than this." She looked at me steadily. She had a particular way of looking at you when she was about to say something true, a kind of settling in the eyes, a stillness. She said, "I wasn't looking for easy, I was looking for real." I didn't know what to do with that. I looked at the fire for a while. She said, "You're a real man, Harlan. Whatever you've let yourself become this past while, that's still what's underneath." I'd been called things: stubborn, difficult, cold. I'd been written off by 2 neighboring ranchers who'd figured my land would go to auction inside 5 years. I'd been looked at with the particular pity people save for a man who can't hold himself together after his wife dies. The kind of pity that feels like contempt in a polite coat. She didn't say it like a kindness. She said it like a fact. The way you'd say a fence post is oak or the ground is granite, not to make me feel better, just because it was true and she'd noticed. I didn't say anything for a long time. The fire moved. The snow hit the window glass, soft and steady. I said, "I haven't been that man in a good while." She said, "I know. I've been watching you find him again." I'd been finding him again. I hadn't put it to myself in those words, but she had, and they fit. All those cold mornings, when I got up before the drinking brain could argue. All those days of work that had started to feel like they meant something again. The 3 heifers that were alive and healthy in the barn. I'd been finding something I'd thought was gone. I looked at her in the firelight. She was looking at the flames. Her profile was plain and strong, and there was no performance in it. She was just there in that room with me. I said, "Thank you." She turned and looked at me, that settling in her eyes. She said, "Don't thank me, Harlan, you did the work." Spring came the way it always does in Wyoming, not gently. A week of warmth and then a last hard freeze and then real thaw, the creek rising, mud everywhere, every hinge and board and fence post on the place showing what the winter had done to it. There was more work than two people could easily manage, and we managed it anyway. I hired a young man from town for the breaking and the fencing, first outside help I'd taken since a leaner, and that felt like something too, like choosing to go on. I'd stopped drinking entirely by April. I didn't make a declaration about it. One night I just didn't reach for the bottle, and the next night I didn't either, and by the end of the week it was a different kind of habit. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it for a long time. Then one evening she said, "You look better." And when she said it, she was looking at me the way you look at something you've been watching carefully and are glad about how it's turning out. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. May, the grass came up green and thick along the creek, and the young stock were out in the pasture, including the red roan heifer we dragged through the snow in December, healthy and full and due to come into her first season in the fall. The mountains still had snow on them, but the near hills were green, and the mornings smelled like wet earth and something was growing. We were out checking the fence along the south pasture. A long job, a full morning, and somewhere around midday she stopped walking and stood looking at the mountains. I stopped beside her. There was no particular reason to stop. The fence was fine there. She said, "I think I'd like to stay if you'll have me." I looked at her. She was still looking at the mountains. I said, "What do you mean, stay?" She turned then and looked at me. No settling this time. She was already settled, already decided. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they've chosen and are at peace with having chosen. Like there was no question being asked. Like the question was already answered and she was just saying so. She said, I mean as your wife if that's agreeable. If it's not, I'd stay on as I am. But I thought you should know what I want." I stood there with a fence wire stretcher in my hand and the May sun on my back and the mountains white above us. There was a meadowlark somewhere in the sage. I could hear it but not see it. It kept singing. I thought about a leaner. I thought about 8 days and how a person can be here and then not here and how you don't stop being theirs just because they're gone. I also thought about a woman who'd come in from Laramie in the cold and looked at a ruined ranch and a ruined man and seen something worth staying for. Who'd carried her own trunk and her chickens and her 3 books and her whole capable self into my falling apart world and just started working. Who'd sat with me in the snow beside a dying heifer until the sky went gray. Who'd said you're a real man like she was reading a fact from the ground. I said, "It's agreeable." She nodded once, like a contract signed. I put the fence wire stretcher down and I took 2 steps toward her and she looked up at me and I could see she'd let herself hope for this. That it was something she'd held carefully like you hold something that might not survive being held too tight. I put my hand on her face and she put her hand over mine and held it there, and we just stood like that for a long moment, the meadowlark still singing, the mountains still there, the fence running away in both directions through the green spring grass. I'm not a man who's going to tell you his heart burst open or the world went bright. That's not the kind of man I am, and it wasn't that kind of moment. What it was, steady. A steadiness I hadn't felt since before a leaner got sick, the feeling of both feet on the ground. She said quietly, "I'll write to the preacher in Gillette." I said, "You do that?" She was still holding my hand against her face, and she turned and pressed her lips against my palm, briefly, warmly, plainly. And then she stepped back and picked up her own tools, and we went back to walking the fence line. We were married in June. 12 people in my front room, the preacher from Gillette who was a compact, serious man and got through the ceremony without any unnecessary words, which I appreciated. The neighboring rancher, Denny Farwell, came, the same one who'd figured my land was going to auction, and he shook my hand afterward and said the place was looking better and meant it. I let myself be glad about that. Her chickens had multiplied to 8 by then, and she'd started a kitchen garden in a patch by the south wall of the house that a leaner had always meant to do something with and never got around to. It was growing. That evening, after the people left, we sat on the porch in the late light. The mountains to the west were turning that deep purple they go before dark. The cattle were settling in the low pasture. Somewhere out there was the red roan heifer, coming into the season now, and I thought about that night in December, How close I'd been to missing it, to just sleeping through it, to waking up to a loss I could have prevented. She'd known I was worrying about them. She'd heard it in the silence over supper, and she'd gotten up in the dark and already had the lantern and the rope. I thought about what I would have lost if she hadn't come at all, not just the heifer, the whole direction of it. The way a man can go so far down a particular road that he forgets there are other roads, can forget so completely that he stops looking for the turnoff. She hadn't turned me around by arguing with me or pitying me or waiting for me to find my feet. She'd just been there, done the work alongside me. Said true things plainly and let them sit. She'd seen something in me worth her time. A good woman, a real woman, had looked at everything I was in my worst season, and she'd decided it was worth her time. I want you to understand what that is to a man. Not to be rescued, not to be managed or handled or propped up with soft words. To be seen plainly for what you are and have someone with their own strength and their own life and their own careful heart decide that you're worth it. That's the thing. That's what it was. She was sitting in the other chair, reading one of her books in the last of the light. She always pushed the reading a little past what was reasonable, until the page was too dim to make out clearly, and then she'd sigh and close it. I said, "What are you reading?" She said, without looking up, "You'll laugh." I said, "No, I won't." She held up the book so I could see the cover. It was a book of poetry. She hadn't had that one before. I didn't laugh. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at the mountains in their purple going dark. I said, "Read me something." She looked up. She smiled, not the short, surprised laugh. Something quieter, something she'd probably been keeping for when there was somewhere to put it. She opened the book and found a page, and she read. I didn't know the poem, and I still couldn't tell you the name of it. But it was about a man and a plane and the light going out at the end of the day and something remaining even after the light was gone. Something in the ground and in the air, and between two people sitting still on a porch. The stars came out. The red roan heifer was somewhere in the dark pasture, alive and healthy and carrying something forward. I was 53 years old and I had lost a great deal, and I had nearly lost myself and I had not. A good woman's hands had found me in the rubble of what I'd become, and she'd held on. Not because I deserved it in any particular way, because she'd looked and she'd decided, and she was that kind of woman, the deciding kind, the staying kind. I sat in that chair on that porch with my wife reading poetry beside me in the last of the light, and I thought about my father building the house in 1851, and about Alina and about Cal, who died owing me money and owing me an explanation, and who'd done, in the end, the one clear good thing that no one could have predicted. He'd written her a letter. She closed the book when the light finally went. We sat in the dark for a little while, just the two of us, the land all around us going quiet, the creek running somewhere in it, cold and steady the way it had always run, the way it would keep running. I put my hand out, open, on the arm of the chair. She put hers in it. That's the whole of the story, that's all of it.